Hello, folks. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our clubs and facilities, as well as the work that I do, takes place within the traditional territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from coast to coast to coast. As a settler, I'm thankful to live, work, and play here. As privileged advocates and agents of change, we need to recognize that we all have the responsibility to work towards truth and reconciliation and to remain open to suggestions and consultations, especially with local Indigenous communities, on how we can repair harm and restore balance. Now, here's the thing about land acknowledgements. They're merely words. I've been reading this book called Unreconciled by Ojibwe author Jesse Wente, and he speaks often about how we as Canadians struggle with the truth of our history with Indigenous communities, let alone reconciliation. Land acknowledgements alone are not an act of reconciliation. We need to ask ourselves, how do we take these words and put them into action? How can we begin to have meaningful conversations with Indigenous communities so that they can be heard and recognized all across our country? I always like to give a challenge every time I read a land acknowledgement. My challenge to you today is to start by reading the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and then determine how many of them we can implement within our facilities. Actions 87 to 91 are specifically related to sport, so let's start there. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video today and to join me. My name is Andrew Paris. I use he, him pronouns, and I live in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, part of which is commonly referred to today as Nova Scotia. Now, the water does not discriminate. Our boats do not discriminate. But we as people sometimes do discriminate. Oftentimes, it's unintentional, but we must never forget that a space that is not inclusive is not a safe space for everyone. The goal of this video today is to provide you with some tools and resources that you can use to ensure that everyone feels a sense of belonging at your club or facility. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're first going to dive into the difference between being a non versus anti. We're then going to talk about what is equity, diversity, and inclusion. We're going to talk about understanding our own bias and privilege. We're then going to get into what is allyship. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with some things to consider when working with equity-deserving communities. A really quick note before we dive into things. Today we're going to do some unlearning. As sport leaders, we often ask our participants or athletes to step outside their comfort zone as part of the learning process or to improve. But we know that stepping outside of our comfort zone can be uncomfortable. But today I encourage you to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Do not run away from that discomfort. Ask questions about the discomfort. Go deeper than one-word answers. Sit in that discomfort and ask yourself, why is it that this conversation is making me uncomfortable? And then go from there. So what's the difference between being non versus anti? For this next part, I'm going to use racism as the example, but we can replace the word racism with discrimination, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, all kinds of different isms really. The difference between being non-racist and anti-racist lies in the level of engagement and action that one takes to address and combat racism. We can all be good people, but if we see something racist that takes place and say or do nothing, in a way, through our inaction, we are condoning that behavior, and that's obviously something that we do not want to do. Being anti-racist involves actively opposing racism, in this case, in all of its forms. Anti-racist individuals go beyond simply not being racist and actively strive to challenge and change the system structures and attitudes that perpetuate racial discrimination and inequality. They take a proactive stance by educating themselves, engaging in difficult and sometimes uncomfortable conversations, and actively working to dismantle racism at both the personal level and societal levels. My hope today is to give you some tools and resources that will help you on your journey from going from non to anti. Before we dive into some learns, I want you to think back to a time in sport, or perhaps it's a time at work or a time at school, you were doing something that you really enjoyed. When you felt included, or a time you felt excluded. In that moment, how did you feel? What were your emotions or feelings, both positive or negative? Feel free to take a moment and pause this video if you like. The reason why I ask that is because we all carry an invisible backpack, if you will. For some folks, depending on what happened at work or what happened at school, that backpack can be really heavy or quite light. But for some folks, that backpack can be heavy because of the color of their skin. For some folks, that backpack can be heavy simply because of who they love. That backpack can be heavy because perhaps they come from a low socioeconomic environment. What if our clubs and facilities could be places where everyone, regardless of their identity, regardless of what they look like, could take off those backpacks and simply go on the water and enjoy our sport? And that's what we want to do. That's what we're talking about. Everybody, regardless of their gender, regardless of their identity, how can they find a space that's welcoming, a space that's inclusive within our clubs and within our facilities? Okay, so let's get into some terminology. When we talk about diversity, we're talking about the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders, different sexual orientations, etc. You can be unintentionally diverse though. And what I mean by that is oftentimes when we look into our clubs and facilities, we see boys, we see girls, we see men, we see women, we see men and women of different ages, we can see men and women of different backgrounds. But perhaps there's nothing intentional that we did there. It was just a matter of opening up our registration and we had a few different folks that come to our facilities. Having an open door to your facility or to your club simply isn't enough. Because if you walk into a space and nobody in there looks like you, or perhaps you feel you can't relate to anybody in that space, then for some that space is not going to feel inclusive. In past jobs, I've been asked many times, hey Andrew, we want to make our club, we want to make our sport, we want to make our office a bit more diverse. What is it that we need to do? And I tell folks, you're asking the wrong question. The question that you should be asking is what can we do to make our facility, what can we do to make our office more inclusive? When we talk about inclusion, we're talking about the effort and practices in which different groups or individuals having different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted and welcomed. Inclusion is being intentional. Inclusion is the work. Inclusion is going beyond that diversity that perhaps we just happen to have, because we want our diversity within our clubs and facilities to be a byproduct of inclusion. So perhaps this means, this is an example, creating an inclusion policy. Because chasing diversity without any focus on inclusion is useless and it won't last long term. An important note about inclusion is when we think about it, we don't want to think about inclusion as a marketing plan. It's important to remember that inclusion is not about making people fit into our clubs or into our systems. It's about changing our programs, changing our structures, changing the way we go about doing things so that everyone feels welcome and can be their authentic self. When we think about equality means providing everyone with the same amount of resources regardless of whether everyone needs them. However, Not everyone requires the same resources or supports. Here in Nova Scotia, we have these individuals that we refer to as African Nova Scotian student support workers. Now, my son, being in school, has had a African Nova Scotian student support worker his entire life. One day he comes home with this brand new laptop. Now, I believe he's in grade 4 or grade 5 at the time. And truth be told, there's any number of ways that a brand new laptop ends up in a grade 4 or grade 5 student's bag. So I asked him, I said, Elijah, where'd you get that laptop from? And he said, my student support worker gave it to me. And I said, why did your student support worker give you this laptop? And he said, well, our student support worker was speaking with our principal, and they said that all the black and brown kids in the school needed a laptop so that they could bring it home and make sure that they got their homework done. Now, as he's saying this, I look over my shoulder at this brand new computer that we just bought for our family. In this particular case, Elijah, despite being biracial, did not need a laptop in order to make sure he got his homework done. Actually, what he needed to do was to get off the Xbox for a moment and actually do your homework. My point being is that was a problem that was looked at through a lens of equality and not equity. Equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. This doesn't mean that equality is bad, but what it means simply is not all black folks are the same. Not all indigenous folks are the same. Not all men are the same, for that matter. Not all women are the same. We have to remember that each person can have different barriers and different challenges to participate in a sport, despite perhaps having some of the same identity characteristics, if you will. Now, as we look back on those terms of diversity, inclusion, equity, and equality, let's think about this for just a moment. If our practices, policies, and programs are equitable, they'll be inclusive. If we're being inclusive, we will eventually see diversity. When all three are truly working together, we will see belonging. Belonging is the human emotional need to be an accepted member of a group. Whether it's family, friends, co-workers, a religion, or something else, we all crave that sense of belonging. It's that inherent desire to belong and to be part of something that's greater than ourselves. As a black man, some folks believe that when I'm referencing equity-deserving communities, that I'm only referring to just race. But in actuality, we need to acknowledge that a number of different groups can be seen as equity-deserving. For example, we know that women and girls typically have a lesser sport experience than men and boys, or those who identify as male. We know that those who have a disability, whether it's something that we can see or not, typically have a lesser sport experience than those who we consider to be non-disabled. We know that those from the 2S LGBTQIA plus community typically have a lesser sport experience than those who are considered straight. We know that those who come from low socioeconomic environments typically have a lesser sport experience than those who don't. So when we talk about equity-deserving communities, it's more than just race. It's more than just what we see on the surface. When we talk about intersectionality recognizes that individuals hold multiple social identities and that these identities can interact and intersect, leading to unique experiences and sometimes different forms of discrimination or privilege. Now, what does all that mean? What that means, for example, is that a black boy can have a different sport experience than a black girl, or in this case, perhaps face different barriers. That black girl can have a different experience and face different barriers than a black girl who identifies as a lesbian. That black girl who identifies as a lesbian can also have different experience or face different barriers than a black girl who identifies as a lesbian who also comes from a low socioeconomic environment. What this ultimately means is that when we talk about how to dismantle barriers or challenges for equity deserving groups, we don't treat everybody the same. We have conversations with the communities in which we're trying to serve and work to break down barriers across all sports. And again, most importantly, recognize that not all barriers are the same based on an individual's identity. So, what is bias? Bias is a tendency to believe that some people, ideas, etc., are better than others, which usually results in treating people unfairly. Now, we all have biases. They can show up differently depending on the situation, our past lived experiences, or our initial reactions depending on how others show up. There's many different types of biases, but I want to focus in on a couple today. The first type of bias I want to focus in on is explicit, which refers to the attitudes and beliefs we have about a person or group on a conscious level. Most times, these biases and their expression arise as the direct result of a perceived threat. Now, the justification of this bias is irrelevant. What do I mean by that? Perhaps you've seen the show called Law and Order, or the many iterations of Law and Order. My mother, she's a huge fan of the show. And I'll never forget this story that she told me once upon a time, that in the early days of this particular show, if there was a person of color in the episode, it meant one of two things. It meant that either that racialized individual was the criminal, or B, they were closely related to the criminal. Now, perhaps your only interactions with racialized individuals have come from what you've seen in Law and Order. Perhaps over time you develop a bias, so every time you see a person of color or a racialized individual, you think, oh, that person's dangerous, that person's a bad person. Now, the justification of that bias is irrelevant, but it's a bias nonetheless. It'd be like saying that white folks are smarter than indigenous folks. I don't care if you've picked that up from YouTube University, or perhaps you heard that from a professor or in a lecture. The justification is irrelevant. That's an example of explicit bias. Now, when we talk about unconscious bias, it's a bias that occurs automatically and oftentimes unintentionally. But nevertheless, it affects our judgments, decisions, and behaviors. Sometimes unconscious bias can be disguised as compliments, also known as microaggressions. So some microaggressions that I've seen over the years is walking into a business room, into a conference hall, and perhaps there only being a couple of women in that room, and those women being identified as those who are setting up the room versus perhaps a vice president or a CEO of a company. Some microaggressions that I've heard over the years are, you're really well spoken for a black person. I've never seen anybody like you who's so well spoken. I also play the sport of curling, where there's also not a ton of diversity. Another microaggression that I've heard is, you're a really good curler for a black person. Now, this one always gets me because, number one, if you've ever met another black person who plays the sport of curling, I want to meet them because I have questions. But number two, if I flip that around and say, well, thank you, you're a really good curler for an old white guy. Well, we see how ridiculous that sounds. That's an example of unconscious bias. Now, when we talk about our biases, they aren't inherently all bad. We just need to make sure that we take the time to learn how to interrupt our biases so that they don't negatively affect our decisions and behaviors. More on that in just a moment. When we talk about privilege, privilege is a right, immunity, or benefit enjoyed by a particular person or a restricted group of people beyond the advantages of most. Now, we all have privileges. You don't need to apologize for your privileges. I'm not here saying to you today that all y'all have privileges, but I don't. So, no, we all have privileges. The fact that I can talk to you today from my home office with all my technology set up and not have to worry about where I'm getting my next meal from or worrying about how I'm going to pay for my mortgage. That's example after example of privileges that I have. You need to be aware of the privileges and your biases that you have to provide an open and inclusive environment for all of your stakeholders, all of your members, and your entire community. Once you're aware of your bias and privileges, we can come up with a strategy on how to manage them or how to mitigate them. Now, it's important to note about privilege. Having privilege does not mean that an individual is immune to life's hardships, but it does mean having an unearned benefit or advantage one receives in society by nature of their identity. Now, let's get into countering our bias and privilege. In a past life, I had the pleasure of being the technical director for Nova Scotia Curling. And in working with our provincial junior teams, we had a mental performance consultant who worked with us. In this particular case, or in this particular year, her name was Tina. And I'll never forget one thing that Tina would tell our teams. Tina would say, if you can identify the stressors and the barriers or the challenges that you face when you're about to throw a shot, perhaps when you miss a shot, then we can come up with a plan on how to deal with them and how to mitigate them. And I believe the same is true for our bias and privileges. If we can name them and understand them and acknowledge them, then we can come up with a plan on how to mitigate our bias and privileges. When we talk about bias, it's not about eliminating it. That's impossible to do for a number of different reasons. But when it comes to being more welcoming or inclusive, we need to get into the habit of countering or interrupting our bias. Some things to consider. First, we need to notice and accept our bias and privilege. Take time to notice them, because once we can name them, like we talked about a moment ago, we can accept them and begin to deal with them. Next, we need to take personal responsibility. Knowing our bias and privileges is one thing, but taking the personal responsibility to change or unlearn our previous ways of thinking, that's turning acceptance into action, and this is where real change begins. Next, we can go in and learn it. When we educate ourselves about issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, we then learn more about the role that we play, both personally and professionally, and what we can do differently. We can then make a plan. And once we make it through those first three pieces that we talked about, we can make a plan with the idea of the plan changing our habits and our practices. It will feel very uncomfortable at first, but it will then get easier over time. Back during the pandemic, I think specifically back to 2021, we saw a number of professional sports teams start to do land acknowledgements before the start of their game. And I can remember looking on social media, and that was super controversial at the time. And some sport organizations took a lot of hate and took a lot of backlash from their fans from doing that. But now when we look at land acknowledgements that professional sports teams do 3 years later, it's no longer a big deal. So let's ask ourselves, what are some of the changes that we can make today that when we look back in a year or we look back in 2 years are no big deal? And lastly, before we go on to allyship, another way that we can help mitigate our bias and privilege is becoming the king or queen of questions. And what I mean by that is asking open-ended questions to interrupt our own bias and privileges. Asking questions And listening to the response without judgment shows empathy and also enhances our ability to learn. Let's take some time now to talk about allyship. And let's start with a definition. Allyship is someone who advocates or actively works for inclusion of an equity-deserving group, but is typically not a member of that group. When we look at allyship, we can divide it into two different categories, if you will. We have performative allyship and we have active allyship. Performative allyship is done to increase one's social capital versus committing to furthering a cause or supporting that group. It's a very long way of saying it may look like allyship on the surface, but we're doing it with the intention of making ourselves look good. Let me give you an example. If you wear an orange shirt on National Truth and Reconciliation Day, but that's the only day of the year that you think about your relationship with local indigenous communities or think about truth and reconciliation, well, that is an act of performative allyship. Where we want to be is we want to be active allies, someone who actively intentionally promotes a culture of inclusion and supports and advocates for those from equity-deserving groups. I'm often asked, Andrew, what can I do to be a better ally? Well, I have some ideas and suggestions for you. It's not an exhaustive list, if you will, but let's get into it. The first thing to remember about allyship is that it's a lifelong journey. Being an ally isn't some gold star to receive or university degree to achieve or some sort of status, if you will. It's a lifelong journey of learning and in some cases unlearn, like we talked about earlier, as well as being willing to act with and for others in pursuit of ending oppression and creating equality. Next is intentionally promoting a culture of inclusion. Once we learn and educate ourselves, it's important that we take that education and put that into action. Because like we talked about earlier, a space that is not inclusive is not safe for everyone. Inclusion should be at the core or towards the top of the list of everything that your club and facility does. But we don't need to start with changing everything overnight, if you will. Let's just start by looking at our practices, policies, procedures, some things, and ask ourselves, are these as inclusive as they could be? And if not, what can be changed or added? Another example is defining what is an inclusive culture within your organization, perhaps via the creation of an inclusion policy. Next, when you see discrimination, call it out. Let the perpetrator of the incident know that that's not okay or funny. Check in and support the victim. Walk away from that racist or homophobic joke. Ask questions to the perpetrator. Why do you think that joke is funny? Why do you believe that to be the case? Showing empathy towards others who are impacted by discrimination is being empathetic and is showing that you care. It doesn't always mean that we need to get into a fist fight or an argument with the perpetrator. Sometimes showing empathy to the person on the receiving end is also calling things out, if you will. Next, broaden your social groups. Connect with folks who are unlike you. Step outside your comfort zone, like we talked about earlier, and have meaningful conversations with individuals outside your regular social group. Listen deeply to others' perspectives without interrupting or feeling the need to respond. Acknowledge the experience of others, even if you've never experienced it before yourself. While noticing the difference of folks around you, also notice the commonalities. Should you notice yourself wanting to debate or interrupt, ask yourself why. Next, there's being the king or queen of questions like we talked about earlier. Asking open-ended questions to interrupt your own biases and privileges. Asking questions and listening to the response without judgment can, again, show empathy and enhance our ability to learn. Next is educate yourself. Be proactive rather than reactive and educate yourself via books, articles, research documents. When learning via social media, Always question the source and do a deeper dive to better understand the topic at hand. But when we talk about education, I think it's also important to remember not to rely solely on equity deserving groups to educate you or coach on issues of race, equality, diversity, sexuality, issues of inclusion. For some folks from equity deserving communities, constantly speaking on those topics can be mentally exhausting or potentially triggering. We have to remember that it's not the job of equity deserving communities to solve or correct the problems that they face. And then lastly on my list, again, it's not an exhaustive list, is listen and accept feedback. Stop saying, I'm not racist, or I'm not homophobic, or I'm not anti-Semitic. Listen. We all make mistakes. Should you say the wrong word, term, or phrase, or unintentionally offend an individual, listen to what they are saying. Don't assume that your intention is clear to anyone else but yourself. Acknowledge the gap between your intentions and how it may have had a different impact than intended. Apologize and work to do better next time. Now that we're on the home stretch of our video, let's talk about some other things to consider when working with equity deserving communities. The first thing to consider, and this is an important one, is we need to truly acknowledge the problem at hand. We need to have an open and honest conversation with ourselves and acknowledge that we haven't done everything possible to ensure that our clubs, our facilities are inclusive and welcoming to everyone. That's just simply a very long way of saying we need to clean our own house first before we invite others in. The next thing to consider is that other communities, equity deserving communities, are not part of the problem. It's not about creating a better marketing plan for indigenous communities or for newcomers or for any other equity deserving communities. It's about changing the way we do business. It's about changing our systems and structures at hand so that everyone who comes in, no matter their background, no matter what they look like or where they come from, that they feel welcome when they walk into our facilities, that they feel that sense of belonging. The next part is developing trust is absolutely crucial. To do work with the community, you have to do work for the community. My grandmother, who lives in East Preston, a large Black community that's part of Halifax, Nova Scotia, she talks to me often about how every February 1st, at the start of Black History Month, so many organizations, including sport organizations, come into the community to want to do work with the community. But when March 1st comes, they leave the community just as quick. That's not developing trust. That's checking the box. And the last thing that we want to do is check a box. We want to develop trust with the community and acknowledge the fact that it's going to take time to develop trust with the community. When we created the Black Rock Initiative, we developed a relationship that took 8 to 9 months to develop with the local indigenous community before we even considered doing programming or putting up a poster. It takes time. We need to acknowledge the fact that it takes time because building trust is absolutely crucial. The next thing to consider is we need to actively listen to the needs of the community. Again, this isn't about checking the box. This isn't about just repackaging programming that we've offered elsewhere or perhaps at our clubs and facilities and bringing it to another community. At the end of the day, so long as Susan, Peter, Emily, or Sean doesn't hurt themselves or somebody else, what difference does it make if we offer a program or build a program that's completely different than anything else we've ever offered? And then lastly, and this isn't an exhaustive list by the way, we need to accept the fact that feedback may not come immediately. When we try something new, when we try something a bit more inclusive, especially if it's a program, it may not be successful the first time. It may not be successful the second time. But failure isn't an endpoint. We want to fail fast and fail forward. Every time we hit a stumbling block with one of our programs, we don't just scrap it and never do it again. We get feedback from what happened, and we take that feedback and we build it into the next iteration of our program. And then we try it again. It's like a loop. Every time we try something, we gain feedback. We look for feedback, whether that's through surveys, whether that's just through simply talking with our participants. And then we take that feedback, build it into our programs, and then do it again. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today in this important conversation about how we can make our clubs, our facilities, and our entire sport more inclusive for everybody. As you reflect on some of the things that we talked about today, I encourage you to go through these 3 steps. What's one thing you're going to start to do today based on the conversation that we've had? What's one thing you're going to stop doing? And what's one thing that you're going to continue to do? Because like we talked about earlier, education is important, yes, but it's important for education to lead to action. And it only takes one step, one change to lead towards creating spaces and places where everybody can show up and be their authentic self. Oftentimes, when I reach the end of videos or when I reach the end of sessions like these, I have folks ask me, so what's next, Andrew? Well, I want you to think of this presentation like me giving you a pair of sneakers, if you will. You can take those sneakers, you can chuck them in the closet, never to be seen again. Or you can take those sneakers and hop on a treadmill and maybe work out a little bit. Or you can take those sneakers, put them on, and go run a marathon, if you will. But that choice isn't up to me. That choice is up to you. It's entirely up to you what you decide and what you choose to do with this information that we've discussed today. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. My name is Andrew Paris. If you want to continue the conversation, by all means, feel free to follow me on X, Instagram, and TikTok at the EDI Coach, or you can simply search my name on Facebook. Thanks again, and I hope you have a fantastic day.